We're incredibly honored to welcome two exceptional leaders and thinkers in AI. James Manyika, who's the Senior Vice President at Google and Alphabet, reporting to the CEO. As President for Research Labs, Technology and Society, he focuses on advancing Google and Google DeepMind's most ambitious and foundational applied innovations in AI, computing, and science in areas that have potential for broad beneficial impact on people and society. He also oversees Google Research, Google Labs, Learning and Sustainability. And I could list maybe 100 different boards, awards, and roles of significant influence on how the world is shaping the trajectory of AI, including notably Vice Chair of the U.S. National AI Advisory Committee, which he served on, and as a co-chair of the UN Secretary General's AI Advisory Body. I'm particularly inspired by James's interdisciplinary background and the profound contributions that he's made to how the world more broadly thinks about technology, productivity, automation, and the impact of AI and work, which an area that he did some groundbreaking research on well before ChatGPT, and has really influenced how the world thinks and is approaching these topics. So we're deeply honored to have him here. And I'd also like to introduce Kenneth Cukier, who's the Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist. Also has made a significant contribution in terms of how we think about really important things from data and innovation to human potential, and has done some phenomenal work in research also with some of my colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute with some highly influential books on these topics. He's the co-author of Framers on the Power of Mental Models and the Limits of AI. And his earlier book, Big Data, was a New York Times bestseller, translated into over 20 languages. Also on several boards and affiliations with Oxford, which both of these speakers notably have, and also is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and an associate fellow at the Oxford Saïd Business School. Please welcome James and Kenneth, and let's give them a huge round of applause and a warm welcome.
James, this is an immense topic. Where in the world to begin? We were just talking, in fact, we were not shutting up before Cassie's very generous and beautiful introductions to us. That's hardly as merited as it sounds. About your work here in Oxford, working on AI. I'm going to go right into that. But more importantly, just as we were quieting down to let Cassidy speak, you had said to me that you wrote your first paper on neural networks while you were in Zimbabwe. Say more.
Yes, well, first of all, Cassie, thank you for that. That was an extraordinary, generous introduction. Delighted to be back in Oxford. Yes, that is true. I mean, so when I was an undergraduate, in a quirk of history and accident, I was searching around for a research project for my undergraduate kind of thesis and paper. And as it happened, there was a visiting postdoc who had come to Zimbabwe from Canada. And in Canada, he had worked with Jeff Hinton. So he said, well, actually, I have a topic to propose to you. Why don't you work on modeling and training neural networks? So that's the paper that I ended up working on. And it actually ended up being published in a journal about a year later. So that's actually the first thing I ever published in my whole life was on neural networks.
There's so much to that. Now, I want to go broad into issues about the economy, into jobs, risks of AI, and sciences, but I want to stay on this for a second. So first, that means that your first published paper was as an undergraduate, not as a graduate student.
Well, it came out after I graduated. It came out a year later.
But you wrote it as an undergraduate in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
So, but then let me stay on this a little bit longer. In the 90s, I think some of the students might not remember, but those of us, and those of them who remember their history will know that that was really just coming out of actually maybe in the depth of the AI winter. And if the AI winter was a winter for any one dimension of AI, it definitely was for neural networks. you couldn't get a job if you said that you were working on AI and on neural networks. It was just two strikes against you.
That is correct. And I should say, by the way, this conversation is particularly terrifying for me, partly because one of my old professors is actually in the room, Lord Tarasenko. I'm not quite sure where he is. And Lord Tarasenko, when I got to Oxford and I was in our research lab, he was actually one of the few people who was working on neural networks. And I remember everybody kept telling me, stay away from this topic. It's a dead end. It's not going to go anywhere. And in fact, if you look at my dissertation, you won't find the word AI anywhere in it. So I was told not to put that word in because nobody would take the work seriously. So that was the case.
And so what word did you use instead?
Oh, we talked about machine perception, machine learning, intelligent systems. There's lots of other words we used, not AI.
So now you've seen the cusp of AI, and in fact, you would leave Oxford with a DPhil, and you'd go into business, and you'd be talking about classical elements of...
I had another quick step before.
Yeah, sure.
And this should be about my biography, but I think it's worth noting, so when I finished my DPhil here at Oxford, I stayed on as a research fellow here for a little bit, but I was also working at Jet Propulsion Labs in the Man-Machine Systems group, where we're trying to build these machine perception systems for the Mars Pathfinder projects.
It worked.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Not at the time when I was working on it.
No, but there's everyone's standing on shoulders of giants. Exactly. Okay, so then you eventually you make your way to a consultancy called McKinsey before Google, and I want to bring that up because there it starts issuing at the sort of its in-house research center the papers on the digital economy and looking at how computers are changing business and therefore society through the economy. Now let's take that optic. You've done so much since then, editing special issue of Daedalus on the economy and AI. Obviously, you had a piece in Foreign Affairs about 2 years ago on that very topic. How have you changed your view on AI and the economy as you've watched, like all of us have, the huge transformation that's taking place right now in the past 2 years?
Well, I think some views have actually changed and others have not. I mean, the early work that I did at McKinsey, I was actually very fortunate because I was working in the McKinsey Global Institute, which I eventually ended up directing. One of the early things I worked on was actually on the technology and productivity work. And one of our academic advisors for that work was Bob Solow. So I actually learned a lot about the Solow paradox and all of that. So in some regards, I learned a lot from that. I think, but if I fast forward to where we are, in some ways, some views haven't changed, but just gotten more accelerated and bigger. One of the, I guess two parts to that. The first was that I've always believed, and the data seems to suggest it, and the research seems to suggest it, that in fact, technology is so fundamental to innovation, productivity, and growth. Witnessed the Nobel Prizes last week as another testament of that. So I think that's always been true. And I also think that, in particular, at a time when anytime you've got a general purpose technology, then it has the potential, of which AI is a general purpose technology, it has the potential to drive innovation and productivity and therefore lift the economy. So I think what's changed is perhaps the mechanism and the type of technology that can actually power productivity is a change that we've seen. So I think in the case of AI, the potential gains from productivity from AI as a general purpose technology are enormous, but none of that is going to be automatic. I think is always a caveat to put against it.
Okay, so let me just pick up on the Solow paradox and ask you to apply it to AI. Are we going to be able to measure and see those productivity gains?
I think we'll have the same, just to explain the Solow paradox. I mean, what Bob Solow had said in roughly about Bob Solow is a famous Nobel Prize laureate. What he had said at the time in the late 80s was that we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And so that lingered for a while until the late 90s, when finally it looked like the paradox was resolved. So I think we may see something similar here, where we may see AI everywhere except in the productivity statistics for quite a while. And then we'll ask the question, why is the case? And I think some of the lessons of the solar paradox apply here. So when I say I think that the productivity gains are going to be enormous, but they're not guaranteed, what are the things that have to happen for those gains to be realized, similar to the solar paradox? I think a few things have to happen. One of those is actually adoption throughout the economy, especially in the large sectors. We know, as happened in the solar paradox, it wasn't until very large sectors in the economy, in that case retail, wholesale, manufacturing, adopted technology that we saw this. Today, you can look at various surveys. I think various surveys suggest that at least in the US, because I remember the numbers, adoption is in the high single digits across enterprises, across many sectors of the economy. So adoption is, I think, a key part of this. The second thing we learned from the solar paradox, which I think also applies here, is that adoption by itself is not enough. What you also need are the transformation of processes and the way organizations work to capitalize on the technology before you start to see the productivity gains. It's a bit of the history of even from the Industrial Revolution, even going from the steam engine to electric motors. You couldn't just drop in a steam engine, an electric motor into a factory that had been set up for steam engines. You had to redo the layout of the process flows, et cetera, before you could take advantage of the new capabilities. So this idea of reorganizations of functions and tasks and operations is another second consideration that has to happen. I would also add quickly a third and a fourth. The third is, you actually want to see the technology applied in what you might call productivity enhancing use cases that actually matter. And that often takes a lot of work. And I think we've yet to fully see that everywhere. And then finally, what the so-called kind of capital deepening. You want to make sure you're empowering the workers to be able to capitalize on the technology to actually improve the labor productivity part of what they do. And then lastly, you have to have a whole set of complementary innovations. So as you can tell from the list I'm trying to outline, a few things have to happen beyond just simply inventing the technology.
Okay. You use the term human labor productivity. That term still makes sense to me? Like why? I can understand productivity. I can sort of understand labor. Human?
Yeah, think about how we think about the generic kind of growth disaggregation, the GDP calculation, right? Labor productivity.
I'm being way too subtle. What I'm trying to suggest is this is labor substituting, not labor enhancing. So skill. For some people, well, let's see. I'll make a case and then tell me why you see it differently. I think for some people, certainly they're going to become empowered with this cognitive exoskeleton, will become Ubermensches, pardon the Nietzschean phrase, but it's Oxford, that you'd be able to sort of do far more, smarter, better than before. But for many other roles, particularly for when robotics comes in, it seems to me that a lot of labor might not be needed anymore. And so actually to judge it in terms of, we thought about horsepower when the automobile was substituting for the horse, thinking about in terms of a rocket ship, horsepower doesn't make as much sense as the unit of metric. So why would we look at this, at human labor productivity and emphasize the human when in fact the human might not be around?
Well, I don't agree that the human might not be around. Most of the studies, certainly including the ones that I was involved in, and even most of the recent ones by others, so I'll cite not my own work, but other work too. I think most of that research says for the foreseeable future, three things will happen. And the three things that will happen may happen in very different proportions depending on what sector, what occupation you're looking at, but you'll see all three things. And those three things are, one, you will see some occupations decline. And those are going to look like occupations where the constituent tasks involved with them are easily automatable. And if you also don't have demand elasticity to drive greater demand for that labor, you're likely to see those jobs decline. So you'll see that. You're also going to see some jobs grow. And the growth will come from a combination of two kinds of jobs jobs, the existing jobs that will see higher demand because of the output of the workers involved in them and the demand that goes with them. It's a bit like what happened with, the old case of the bank teller example. But you'll also see growth come from new jobs. I think we forget that, for example, if you take a look at the US economy, since roughly 1945, something like 85% of the occupations that we see today didn't exist before that. And something like 60% of the job growth came from new occupations that were not categories that existed. So this idea of job growth in the face of technology is also a second thing you'll see. But perhaps the most important thing is actually the third thing. And the third thing are jobs that are going to change. And this is occupations where the tasks, what people do will have some portions of their tasks automated, a whole lot that are not. And so the effect is going to be this augmentation effect. In fact, in the studies that I worked on, the estimate was something like 2/3 of occupations will see that kind of effect. If you don't like my numbers, Ken, recently there's been a lot of interesting work that the International Labour Organization, ILO, has been doing. And their latest report, where they looked at something like 140 countries, looking at something like 400 occupations, suggested that the augmentation effect was going to be 6 times the displacement effect. So you look at all these things, all 3 things will happen. Now, that's not to say that picture looks exactly like that in every occupation, in every sector, everywhere. You'll see there'll be some occupations where you may see more of the displacement and less of the job growth. In other words, you see more of the job growth and change, but the net looks like it has all 3 things going on.
It's always difficult to look to the future and see what isn't there. But I'm going to try to ask you to do that. With the weak signals that you're picking up here and there when you talk to business leaders and just look at the economy, what do you think will be a job of tomorrow that scarcely exists today?
That's why it's so hard to predict.
Yeah, of course.
It's always so hard to predict. And I think it's easier to predict and talk about jobs you think might expand, enabled by technology, because of the demand elasticity that I just talked about. In terms of new jobs that don't exist, it's hard to imagine. I mean, think about what happens in the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the States. Mm-hmm. They only introduced new occupations after a decade. Right? So I think it's very hard to predict that. But we may see new glimmers of it. We may see new kind of support roles or roles around the ecosystem of AI that may not be there before. You may see that around the ecosystem of robotics that may not be there before. Yeah. We're starting to see a little bit of that even with our Waymo cars, which I'm excited that they're coming to London soon. We just announced that yesterday, actually. But even that, we're starting to see roles around that ecosystem of the Waymo car that didn't exist before.
So it's interesting. One thing that I'm seeing is just the role of executive coaches. 20 years ago, you had to be the CEO and you might have an executive coach. You might even meet Peter Drucker or Clay Christensen walking into your office, right? And now it's just shrunk down to SME CEOs, right? And senior executives. And in fact, the company is flooding the zone with support staff for their executives to turn them into being better. Yeah.
Oh, you certainly see that because particularly, in my neck of the woods, and I live in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, you have a lot of CEOs who become leaders very, very quickly, having been very focused on one part of what they do. And so you often find that the rounding out or these other activities around that then are augmented in interesting ways by other roles that haven't existed before.
Yeah.
I definitely see that.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of sunniness to how AI is going to change the jobs and going to change the economy. There's some dark sides to AI as well. What's the 1 or 2 that you have on your list?
You mean with regards to AI and work specifically?
No, I'm thinking more just AI and society. I mean, for me, I would think privacy, people are always apoplectic about what it means for how militaries are reinventing themselves, a rivalry between the US and China for supremacy. You could go down the list of lots of different ways in which there's I think if you ask people outside of august halls like Oxford, people have more anxiety about AI than they do probably for the economy, but for these other reasons as well. more anxiety about AI than they do about optimism about AI.
Yeah, so I and my colleagues think a lot about both sides of that. On the one hand, there's lots we're excited about: economy, science, and all of these things from AI, but also things that we are very concerned about and we think about. So I tend to think about the complexities and risks in at least a few different categories, each of which you can imagine working your way through differently. On the one hand, I think I think a lot about some of the performance, reliability, shortcomings of this technology. Sometimes it's not accurate, sometimes there's hallucinations, but those are, think of those, that category as kind of performance gaps or things we have to make this technology do better. So you've got that. You've got a second category that I think of as kind of the misapplication and misuse of this technology. So think deep fakes, think cybercrime, think there's a whole range of ways in which this technology could be misused by any number of actors. There could be criminals, there could be, terrorists, it could be companies, it could be governments, it could be any number of actors who can misuse this technology in ways that we would not like. So you've got that category to think about. Then you've got a third category, which is different. And this is where the technology just kind of rearranges how we've set up society to work. And there's some things lost and some things gained. You could argue work is in that category. You could argue education is in that category. You could argue the way creative industries work is in that category, where it's almost like a rearrangement with some things lost, some things gained, and also have to think about that. Then, of course, you've got the whole category of things to think about regarding kind of national security, geopolitics, and those kinds of things. So I think about complexities and risk in all those categories.
So let's think about solutions as well. One of the most tricky elements in the AI age is not just AI slop and hallucinations, but this sort of epistemological crisis of truth and the responsibility of technology platforms to find mechanisms by which it can have some degree of assurance of validity, of that there is truth on the platform. Google is different than social media, than classical social media companies, obviously, but you're an enormous gateway to information. And it's a national security imperative, particularly if there's a time of crisis, because we've seen in the hybrid war of conflicts that are both, whether it's Russia's invasion, Russia's cyber attack on Estonia or what's going on in Ukraine, that the information war was just as apparent, although less noticed, than the quote-unquote kinetic war. What is it that a large platform like Google can do, or what are you doing from a hardcore national security basis to create an information environment in which there is an element of truth that can be ascertained in some way, rather than a world in which it's anything goes?
Yeah, so a few things. On the one hand, I mean, we spend an enormous amount of time on cybersecurity. And I think arguably, you could argue we have some of the best cybersecurity systems in the world that have been hardened. And in fact, so there's that part of it that we spend a lot of time on. There's also a lot of time we spend on, particularly in this AI moment, thinking about how do we create mechanisms to indicate when content and things have been synthetically generated or artificially generated. So, for example, I think we were one of the first companies to actually, initiate this, technical innovation around watermarking, digital watermarking, synth ID, which we built into all of our synthetically generated materials. So at least there's this kind of watermarking technology, but it's the kind of thing you'd want the whole ecosystem to adopt. But there's kind of innovations of that kind that we're working on quite a bit. Then there's a whole bunch of other things which have to do with what happens, online. So in some ways, we've got YouTube, which is not really a social platform, but really a streaming platform, because there's no kind of sharing features there. But even there, we have content policies that we try to stick to quite a bit. And as you might expect, from time to time, we get a lot of people complaining about How come you didn't let this? How come you allowed this? But there are very clear policies and guidelines. We try to follow with that. But I think the questions about truth in some ways are much wider societal questions. Because in any one audience, there are things that, somebody will say, that's not the truth. And the different room, people say, well, that is the truth, right? So I remember earlier on, for example, when we first put out Bard, our chatbot, it's now called the Gemini app. I remember some of the comments we got from people using it was that Bard was biased because it said climate change was real, right? So, but those, to me, that's a more societal question about what do societies want to think about, what counts as factual truth. We try to stay committed to kind of accredited sources and things that follow our policies.
You should read our letters to the editor of The Economist. They're just a little bit less genteel than when they email.
Oh no, we get the less genteel ones too.
Okay, all right, very good. We've got filters for that as well. I'm going to open it up for questions in just a minute, but I'm going to end my portion of these questions by thinking about science, technology, and innovation. AI clearly has so much to offer, and in fact, in this very country, we've seen 2 Nobel laureates last year for their accomplishments in AI. When you look at the potential for how AI can change the frontier of knowledge, what do you look to?
Oh, this I think is one of the perhaps undertold stories that we all should be quite excited about. I mean, obviously everybody knows the story of AlphaFold. Debus and John got a Nobel Prize for it last year. But at least in our world, when I think about what we're doing at Google and Alphabet, I can give you a list of like 15 AlphaFold-like breakthroughs, whether it's in material science, in genomics. We've used AI, for example, to publish the first pangenome. People forget when the human genome was first sequenced in the early 2000s, that was actually a single genomic assembly, as opposed to one that represented kind of the full diversity of humanity. So we did the first reference pangenome. So whether it's things in structural biology, including proteins and now cells and all of that, and then you've got things where we're using AI to understand the structure of the brain and the wiring of the brain with some breakthroughs enabled by AI. Then you go all the way to material science, where, for example, some of our AI tools have enabled us, for example, in one instance, we're able to discover almost something like 2.2 million crystals that didn't exist before, and of which something like a couple 100,000 of them are stable enough to be synthesized. And now some people are working on that, on doing that, all the way to weather forecasting, climate science. So if you think about the range of significant breakthroughs, and the nice thing about these scientific breakthroughs is that from AI, often they show up in scientific journals. So they go through peer review and all the rest of it. I think just before we came on, I was just telling you about something we announced just yesterday in a paper that was published in Nature yesterday about how one of our AI systems, which is cell to sentence, which takes kind of transcriptomic information from cells and translates that into language and then be able to make novel predictions. Where in that case, they came up with a novel prediction for a new cancer pathway, which was then validated in vitro in actual living cells at the University at Yale, and we just published it. So you see all of that, and you think about how that actually empowers scientists. Actually, the best part of the AlphaFold story for me, obviously it's an extraordinary breakthrough, but is the fact that we actually open sourced that. The protein predictions. And now, I think as of last month, something like 3.4 million biologists in over 190 countries are using that to work on a whole range of things,
now, James,
which I think is extraordinary.
James, I've been watching Google for 2 decades doing extraordinary things, almost like the Bell Labs of American industry for the modern age. But maybe the curse could potentially be that you're closer to the Xerox PARC of the modern age, in which you've created all these foundational inventions, but someone else exploits them. AlphaFold might be the exception that proves the rule. If you indeed have 15 other AlphaFolds within Google, how do you get them out of Google?
Well, we're trying to do that. We'll stay with the AlphaFold example. So even though, as I said, we've open sourced it, and lots of people are now working on all kinds of things, we also created Isomorphic Labs, which is our own startup to actually try to exploit the discoveries from AlphaFold into drug discovery. And in fact, later this year, we actually have a couple of drugs in trial through collaborations that we're doing with Novartis and a few others. So we're trying to do both things here, which is do this foundational research. I mean, even take the transformer, which is the underpinning of these large language models, was actually invented by Google Research in Google Brain and published to the world in 2017. And arguably, we wouldn't have large language models but for the transformer architecture.
How does Google? So I'm not gonna let you go on this, and then I'm gonna open up to questions. How does Google need to change to enable the innovations within Google to get out of Google? If you have 15 and then you've mentioned AlphaFold and Isomorphic, then there's 13 that are somewhere on a shelf that need to go yonder.
So they're not on a shelf. They're not on a shelf. So first of all, they're not on a shelf. First of all, we often put these in open source. So a lot of the work in science that I mentioned in genomics and so forth, those are all open access. So hopefully other scientists are taking advantage of them. But we're taking advantage of them too. So one of the things we have at Google is Google Labs, for example. Now, Google Labs' role is not to do fundamental research. In fact, Google Labs' role is to draw on the best research coming out of Google DeepMind and Google Research, try to build products out of it. So we try to build products out of these things. So some of you may have played with products like Notebook LM and so forth. That came out of Google Labs, drawing on this foundational research. We also have these moonshot entities and companies. So when we have innovations where we think look like products, we try to turn them into products. When we have innovations that we think look like potential companies, look at Waymo. That's how Waymo started.
Fair enough.
Waymo started as a research project 14 years ago. And now Waymo, I mean, I live in San Francisco. We've actually had Waymo cars running around San Francisco now for 2 years. In fact, if you're in San Francisco, it almost feels like you're in the future because a third of the paid rides of anything in the city are actually Waymo rides. And in fact, Waymo just reached a new milestone. It's now done over 100 million miles, paid miles, with cars running around autonomously. They're far safer than anybody can imagine on any number of metrics. So that's an example of something that came out of as a research idea, took a long time, a decade or more. Now it's a service. That's extraordinary. We're doing a whole bunch of things with the same thing. Look at actually one of the other, since it's Nobel season, 2 weeks ago, one of the people who got a Nobel Prize was in our quantum lab. So our quantum team is a big, ambitious investment we've had for a long time, for over a decade. Who knows when we'll have a fully error-corrected quantum computer, but we're making progress along the way and a whole bunch of innovations in science from doing the work on quantum computing. So that's another example. Maybe in a decade or so, we'll be talking about the quantum lab in the same way we're talking about Waymo today, because it began as a research project a decade ago.
We're like Western Union, where it's like, oh yeah, there was a telegram system. Yeah. So it's like, oh yeah, there once was a thing called search, but what a great quantum company. Right. Google Quantum, great. Dr. James Manyika of Google, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.